My name is Camille Devereaux, and I was 29 years old the night I learned that the most dangerous assumption a person can make about you is that your silence means you have nothing to say. For 2.5 years I wore a kind of invisibility inside my husband's family, not the passive kind, the deliberate kind, the kind you develop when your work requires absolute stillness under pressure. When the difference between calm and panic, between a steady hand and a trembling one, is the difference between someone going home to their family or not. Pierce came from old Chicago money, the kind that accumulates over 3 generations and starts to feel like personality. His mother, Nadine, had grown up on the North Shore and carried herself with the specific brand of confidence that comes from never having had to justify her presence anywhere. Her Gold Coast townhouse had crown molding, a butler's pantry, and a social calendar managed with the precision of a military campaign. Pierce's older brother Sterling was a corporate litigator who'd made partner at 34 and had never fully recovered from the pride of it. He entered rooms like he was expecting someone to start a timer. They were a family that measured worth in visibility, how loudly you spoke, how naturally you dropped phrases like our firm or our club or when we were in Tuscany. Everything was a credential, everything was a signal, and I was a person who drove a used Subaru, kept my nails short and unpainted for professional reasons, and almost never talked about my job at dinner. The first time Nadine introduced me to her bridge circle, she said I worked over at Northwestern, in the same breezy tone someone might use to describe a niece who was doing something with nonprofits. After a while, I stopped filling in the details. It wasn't cowardice, it was calculation. I had a 7:15 a.m. procedure the next morning, and explaining myself to women who had already decided what I was would cost more than I had to spend. What Pierce's family believed about me: I had unusual hours. I came home tired. What they didn't know: I was a cardiothoracic surgeon on Northwestern Memorial's transplant team. I had spent 11 years in training, 4 years of medical school, 5 of surgical residency, 2 years of subspecialty fellowship in pediatric heart surgery. And I had recently published a paper on a modified approach to aortic valve repair in pediatric patients that had been cited in 19 peer-reviewed journals in 8 months. My colleagues called the approach the Devereaux procedure. The licensing fees from the surgical instrument patent I held with my research partner had been accumulating quietly in an investment account for 3 years. I had never once mentioned any of it at a family dinner. The Harrington Medical Foundation Gala was held on the second Saturday in October at the Intercontinental on Michigan Avenue, pediatric heart care fundraiser, which I noted with the kind of tired recognition you develop when the universe keeps insisting on irony. The event drew surgeons, executives, hospital board members, and the category of Chicago wealth that puts its name on hospital wings and then arrives annually to be thanked for it. Pierce's firm was in the running for the foundation's primary legal retainer, a 3-year account worth more than I made in a decade of operating. Nadine had pulled every string she had to secure a VIP table. Sterling had spent the preceding week reminding anyone who'd listened that he had the relationship with Harrington's people and that this evening was going to change everything for the firm. Dr. Marcus Harrington, System CEO of Northwestern Memorial, the exact man Pierce's firm needed to impress, was known for being impossible to charm. I had met him once 7 months ago in a corridor outside the surgical ICU. He'd stopped me to ask a follow-up question about a patient outcome. I'd been wearing scrubs and a surgical cap, and was already 10 minutes late for a procedure. The conversation had lasted under a minute. I didn't expect him to remember it. I wore a simple navy dress to the gala, knee-length, no embellishment. I owned 2 formal dresses. That number accurately reflected my interest in events like this one. Nadine was waiting in the hotel lobby in a champagne gown and a mood of barely contained triumph. She kissed Pierce's cheek, then turned to the senior partner from Pierce's firm and his wife and said, in a voice calibrated to carry without seeming like it was trying, "And this is Pierce's wife, Camille. She's over at Northwestern. You know how it is with hospital people, they live for the routine of it. Long shifts, quiet work, very steady. We're just grateful Pierce has someone stable waiting for him at home." The partner's wife gave me a smile that was mostly pity. "That must be so grounding," she said. "Not everything needs to be high stakes." "It really doesn't," I said and let her hear agreement in it. Nadine touched my elbow with one manicured hand as we moved toward the ballroom. "We're so glad you could make it tonight, sweetheart," she said in the voice she used when she needed me to be scenery and was relieved I was cooperating. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and found my seat. The ballroom was everything the ticket price promised. Round tables of 8 under crystal chandeliers, waitstaff in white jackets, the murmur of several hundred people performing carefully for each other. I sat toward the middle of the table. Pierce sat beside me but angled away, half turned toward the next most important person in the way he'd been angling away from me for roughly the past year, in the slow, barely perceptible drift that happens to some marriages before either person is ready to name it. Dr. Harrington was seated 2 tables over. He was a compact man in his early 60s with gray at his temples and the deliberate stillness of someone who'd spent decades reading rooms. I watched him deflect 3 attempts at flattery without appearing to notice he was doing it. He wasn't cold, he was precise. There's a difference. Sterling arrived 12 minutes after the rest of us, ordered a scotch before he sat down, and spent the first 40 minutes of dinner retelling a deposition story he'd clearly told several times that week. The details had gotten sharper with repetition. He had the kind of charisma that required a lot of maintenance, always performing, always slightly too loud, always watching for the moment when the audience's attention flickered so he could pull it back. Somewhere between the salad course and the entree, he found me. I don't know what started it. Maybe I'd been quiet for too long and he needed a target. Maybe he was building himself up for the Harrington table. But he swiveled in his chair, pointed at me with the hand holding his scotch, and said with cheerful condescension, "Camille, you're over at Northwestern doing some kind of admin thing, right?" "I work in the surgical department," I said. Right. He nodded in the brisk way people do when they've decided not to actually update their picture of you. "Patient scheduling, case coordination, that kind of thing?" "Not exactly," I said. He grinned and looked around the table to make sure he had an audience. "Come on, no need to be modest. Hospital admin is important work. Somebody's got to keep things running while the surgeons do their thing. Unsung heroes, honestly." He spread his hands generously. "I've always said that." Pierce laughed from the seat next to me. A short, accommodating laugh, the kind he used to signal solidarity with the room rather than with his wife. "Camille's always been more of a behind-the-scenes person," he said loudly enough for the table to hear. "She's not really built for the high-pressure side of things. We're just glad she found something she's comfortable with." I looked at my husband. He was watching Sterling, not me, already calculating the approval return on what he'd just said. I thought about the surgery I'd performed the previous Thursday. An 11-year-old with a congenital defect in her aortic valve that 2 other surgical teams had declined to touch. 7 hours and 20 minutes on the table. I had closed her chest at 1:40 in the morning and sat in the hospital parking garage afterward for 4 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I picked up my fork. But Sterling wasn't done. He had a thread and he liked the sound of unraveling it. He leaned back in his chair, addressing the table at large with the easy authority of a man who believed he was always the most interesting person in any room. "You know what I've always thought? People fall into 2 categories. Arena people and stands people. No value judgment, the world needs both." He glanced at me. "Camille seems like a stands person, very calm, very steady. Nothing wrong with watching other people do the heavy lifting, keeps the support system functioning." A few people at the table laughed, the polite, uncertain kind. Nadine smiled into her champagne glass. The partner from Pierce's firm looked at the centerpiece. Sterling wasn't reading the room, he was too busy performing for it. "I mean, be honest," he said, leaning forward now, resting his elbows on the table. "Have you ever actually been in a real high-stakes situation? Like, something where if you got it wrong it actually mattered?" He tilted his head at me with the theatrical innocence of someone asking a question they've already answered. "I'm just curious. Some people thrive on that. Other people, you know." He shrugged. "Better suited for environments where the stakes are a little more manageable." The table absorbed this. A few people looked at their plates. I said nothing. I looked at the centerpiece, white dahlias in a low arrangement, and let him have his moment. That was when I noticed Dr. Harrington had stopped eating. The stillness at his table was small but absolute. He had set his fork down on his plate with the careful deliberateness of a man who had just made a decision. He placed his napkin on the table. He turned in his chair and his gaze moved past Nadine, who immediately brightened and sat straighter, already reaching for the smile she'd been rehearsing for this exact moment, and past Pierce, who had gone very still with his wineglass hovering in mid-air. Dr. Harrington looked at me. The ambient noise of the ballroom seemed to drop one register. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, in a voice calibrated for exactness rather than volume, "but are you Dr. Devereaux? Camille Devereaux from Northwestern's Cardiothoracic Unit?" The table held its breath. I felt Sterling's posture change beside me, the slight deflation of a man whose soundtrack has just been cut off mid-sentence. "Yes, sir," I said, 2 words steady. Dr. Harrington stood up from his table. The movement was quiet, but the room responded to it the way rooms respond to genuine authority. A spreading stillness, heads turning, conversations losing altitude. He walked the short distance to our table, and as he did, several people at neighboring tables turned to watch, because when a man like Marcus Harrington crosses a room towards someone, it means something. He stopped beside my chair. "Dr. Devereaux," he said, and his voice had the particular warmth of someone honoring a debt they've been waiting to acknowledge. "My daughter Emma had her surgery at Northwestern last March, valve repair, 18 hours. The team told my wife and me there were maybe 3 surgeons in the country who'd have attempted what you attempted." He paused. "You were the only one available in time." The table had gone completely silent. "She started the cross-country season this fall," he said. "Her pediatric cardiologist cleared her with no restrictions. 8 months ago we didn't know if she'd—" He stopped. He took a breath. "I've wanted the chance to say thank you in person. I didn't know you'd be here tonight." "I'm so glad she's running," I said. "How's her endurance holding up?" He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "She's beating her teammates. She asked me to put a climbing wall in the garage." "That's a very good sign," I said. He nodded slowly. He straightened and looked around at the table, at Pierce, at Nadine, at Sterling, who was sitting very still, a Scotch glass untouched in front of him. "You have someone remarkable at your table," Dr. Harrington said pleasantly, to no one in particular. "I hope you're aware of that." He returned to his seat. The dinner continued, but it was a different dinner. Nadine recovered first because she always did. She had spent decades perfecting the fast pivot, the seamless subject change, the graceful redirect. Within 90 seconds, she was leaning toward the partner's wife and saying something about what a small world medicine was, and wasn't it interesting how specialized things had become? Her voice was smooth and perfectly controlled, and she didn't look at me once. Sterling said nothing for the remainder of the meal. Pierce stared at the table in front of him, with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that kept coming out wrong. We drove home in silence. The city moved past the windows in amber and white. After about 12 minutes, Pierce said without looking at me, "Why didn't you tell me?" "I've tried," I said. "You've introduced me to your wife who works at the hospital for 2.5 years. At your firm Christmas party last year, I mentioned a procedure I was preparing for and you changed the subject." "I didn't realize." "I know," I said. He drove. The silence had a different texture now, not the comfortable kind, the kind where the shape of something is finally becoming visible. "Sterling is going to." Sterling told the CEO of my hospital system that I was temperamentally unsuited for high-pressure situations, I said. "At a gala for pediatric heart surgery, he can feel however he wants about it." Pierce didn't answer. We drove the rest of the way home in silence that said more than either of us had managed to say in months. The next 3 days were quiet. Nadine texted Pierce, not me. Sterling didn't call. I went to work. I had 2 scheduled procedures, a department meeting about the spring research symposium and a call with the medical device company about the next phase of the instrument licensing agreement. I came home to a husband who was trying to determine which version of events would cost him less with his family. By the 4th day, he had decided. Nadine arrived at the house with a man named Clifford, the family attorney, bow-tied and precise, and a manila folder. Pierce let them in. I was in the kitchen. Nadine appeared in the doorway with her arms crossed in the way people stand when they've already rehearsed what they're about to say. She wanted a clean separation, The prenuptial modification Clifford had apparently drafted within 72 hours of the gala would protect Pierce's family trust, his premarital condo, his equity in the firm. What I stood to receive was defined and minimal. The document, Clifford explained, used mutual language, a full waiver of any claims to separately held assets acquired before or during the marriage by either party. Both parties. I read it twice. I am a surgeon, I read carefully. I thought about what separately held assets meant in my case. Not my hospital salary, though it was substantial. The 7 years of research grants accumulated and invested because my expenses were low and my financial habits were disciplined. The patent I held jointly on the valve repair instrument, licensed to 3 medical device manufacturers. The licensing fees that had been paid quarterly into an investment account I'd opened before I met Pierce. The consulting arrangement, the speaking circuit fees. The portfolio I had built incrementally and quietly while my husband's family discussed Tuscany and club memberships, and whether the kitchen renovation should use marble or quartz. My independently held assets were a number that would have made Clifford set down his pen if he'd known to ask. He hadn't asked. This is a full mutual waiver, I said. Whatever I hold separately, he waives all claims. Whatever he holds separately, I waive all claims. Clean break. That's correct, Clifford said, with the settled confidence of a man who had accurately assessed the threat on the other side of the table. I picked up the pen. I signed each page, I initialed the clauses. I signed the final line and pushed the folder back across the table. Nadine let out a slow breath and placed her hand over Pierce's. This is the right thing, she said to him, not to me. I stood, carried my coffee cup to the sink and rinsed it. I'll have my things out by the weekend, I said. I have a colleague with a truck. Nadine turned. She'd expected something from this moment, some visible fracture, some proof that she'd won. When she didn't get it, a new uncertainty moved through her expression, something she didn't quite have a word for. You should know, she said carefully, that Sterling has connections on the hospital board. After what happened at the gala, he's not going to let it go without consequences. I turned around. I looked at her with the same expression I use when a surgical resident tells me something is impossible. Sterling has a contact on the hospital board, I said. Dr. Harrington is the CEO of the entire Northwestern Memorial Health System. He appoints the board. She opened her mouth, closed it. I walked out of the kitchen. The on-call suite at the hospital was small and clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the parking structure. I had lived in worse places during residency. I moved my things out of the house the following Saturday, taking only what belonged to me, and left the signed agreement on the kitchen counter where Pierce would find it. He texted me 11 days later from a number I didn't recognize, because Clifford had apparently done some research. The message said the mutual waiver covered my patent licensing income and he wanted to talk. I was between procedures. I typed back, "You signed the same document I did, so did I." He called twice that afternoon. I was scrubbed in both times. He was waiting outside the surgical tower at 7 that evening. He looked like a man who had been doing math for 2 weeks and kept arriving at a number that didn't make sense to him. The suit was the one from the gala. The certainty was not. The licensing income, he said. Clifford didn't know. Clifford didn't ask, I said. Camille. Pierce. I stopped on the sidewalk outside the entrance. For 2 years and 7 months your family introduced me as your wife who works at the hospital. Your brother spent an hour at a foundation gala for pediatric heart surgery, telling your firm's partners I was a standsperson who'd never been in a high-stakes situation. Your mother called me your support system, and you sat next to me and laughed, because you needed them to like you more than you needed them to know me. The floodlights from the parking structure were harsh and yellow. He looked older in them. You had Clifford draft that agreement in 4 days to protect the family money from whatever you assumed I might come after, I said. The assumption was that I didn't have anything worth protecting. That was your mistake. I signed the exact same document you signed. You should have told me. You should have asked, I said once, in 2.5 years. He didn't have an answer for that. The truth of it sat between us on the sidewalk, visible in a way that nothing had been visible in a long time. He looked at the ground, then at me. I didn't know who you were, he said. It came out quiet, almost genuine. I know, I said. I was trying to show you, you just weren't looking. I walked to my car. The night was cold and clear. I didn't look back, not because I needed to make a point, but because there was simply nothing back there that I needed anymore. The foundation called me in February to speak at the spring symposium. Dr. Harrington delivered the introduction himself. He used my full name, my title, and described the procedure and its outcomes in the specific language of someone who had spent months reading the research. When he was done, the room, 300 physicians, cardiologists, board members, donors, stood up. I stood at the podium and looked out at all those faces, and I thought about every dinner table I had sat at quietly, every introduction that had turned me into a footnote, every conversation that had kept going around me like I wasn't there. I thought about how much energy I'd spent making myself smaller to avoid an argument that was never going to resolve itself at the dinner table anyway. The thing I know now that I didn't know then, silence isn't weakness. The people who need you to explain yourself to feel comfortable around you were never going to believe your explanation anyway. They've already decided. Your words won't change the picture they've drawn. Only the truth can do that, and the truth doesn't need your help, it just needs time and the right room. People who try to make you feel small are almost always guessing at what you're capable of. They're working from the assumption that what they can see is all there is. Let them guess. Let them be confident in their guess. The less they know, the more thoroughly surprised they'll be when the full picture finally surfaces. And it always surfaces, usually in the exact room where they least want it to. You don't need to announce yourself at every dinner. You don't need to correct every wrong assumption made by someone who won't listen. You don't need to perform your value for people who have already voted against it. You just have to keep doing the work. Because the work speaks in rooms those people can't control. If you've ever been sitting at a table while someone built a whole story about who you are without asking you a single question, if you've ever smiled and stayed quiet while someone described you to their friends and gotten every detail wrong, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below. And if someone you know needs a reminder today that what other people can't see doesn't make it less real, share this with them. Subscribe to Tabby Revenge for more stories about the moment when the truth finally decides it's done waiting.